Welcome to another Supplemental, guys. This is my more loosely scripted podcasty type show, and this is part 2 of How to Write Science Fiction. And once again, I'm joined by a very special guest, Marc Price. If you say hello, Marc.
Hello.
And
that was an awkward hello. I'm already diving into it for all insecure. Hello. Hello.
Yeah, so
please like me.
So we encountered each other totally randomly on Twitter when it's like the nerdiest thing, where I was talking about space battles, and then you sent me a clip from your film Dune Drifters.
Yes.
Yeah, and
I was like, "Oh, you like space battles? I like space battles." Oh, yeah. I made one in my living room. Look.
And it looked awesome. Yeah, it looked really, really cool.
Thanks,
like, well, yeah, I mean, it had like great miniature effects and that all that kind of stuff. And you did like what the Mandalorian was doing, but like on a fraction of the cost in your living room and things.
It was before we learned that the Mandalorian were doing it that way, using projection and stuff as well. So when we saw it, I think a lot of the people working on the film got really excited. It was like, we're like the Mandalorian, except for 50 quid. It's fine. Well, I mean, we're not quite there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it looked great, and like in the Discord server, I'll probably put a link to the behind the scenes or to the producer's cut of the film that you sent me and things, because I think it's a really good little kind of sci-fi thing. How did you start writing science fiction or stories in general? When did you sort of make the decision, like, I want to make write stories or tell stories kind of thing?
I think I was in school. I think it was about 14, 15. I think I discovered the sort of script format. I think I bought a couple of Quentin Tarantino scripts because they were like sort of a hot topic. Because I think I'm 41, so this is when I was a teenager, about 93, 94, and so I saw how a feature film script was formatted. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'd like to kind of write something like that. And so I just started writing, and I've still got those scripts, and they're like an agonizing reminder of how far you grow. But like it's nice to have that, because of course, like, you don't think like I certainly wasn't thinking like anything close to a professional writer at the time. So I would always look at them and sort of shuffle through them, and I'd say, oh wow, I wrote that. That's not brave because I didn't know what I was doing. It's sort of ignorance that I can now take that and apply that to something now that I'm a little bit more familiar with how I like to structure a story. So that's kind of, I think that's where I started, and I just kind of kept writing things that I didn't make. And the thing that's quite strange, I've only realized recently, speaking to other filmmaker friends, other writer friends, is that I kind of always got to the end. There weren't many that I didn't finish, and I realize only in the last few years have I realized that getting to the end of a thing is the real challenge for people.
It is really difficult, getting that first
like
draft.
How about yours? You get to the end of yours, don't you? Did we talk about this before? You do finish them?
I try to. I've actually got several screenplays that are unfinished, unfortunately, in folders somewhere. Because I have funny little modes which I switch in, or moods, where I get really obsessed with something for like 6 weeks, and then I switch to something else. Where like one time I'll be in like a really big like Star Trek mood or something mood, and I'll be like, what am I writing that's like that? And then I'll start writing it, and I'll go, oh, this is going really well, and I like this, and I'll get like 2/3 of the way through it, and then like nearing the end, literally I've got like 2 acts of 3-act screenplays done, and I'll be like near the end, and then I'll be like, oh, I'm in a different mood now, where I'll be like, I'm in like a historical mood or something like that, and then I'll start watching Gladiator and historical epics, and then I'm like, maybe I could write something like this, and then I'll start writing that, and it just sort of, so eventually I do finish things, but I like get around to it, where I get like 2/3 of the way through, and then I come back to it ages later, and I go, well, this is rubbish, and then I rewrite it again, and then I finish it. But
that's okay though. That's a process. I think. I think there's I think it's kind of, there's a different thing when someone's like, oh, I've got writer's block, I can't figure this out, and it's like, oh, you don't have to write anything. You can get some red text, stick that there, say, need something to bridge this to this, and then just write the next bit.
Oh yeah, that's like one of the most helpful pieces of advice, is that you don't need to like, you can jump about. You can like write the bits that you know how to write, and then come back to the bits that you need to fill in later. Because it's like, sometimes when you hit that wall, you're like, oh, I don't know what to put here, but I know that like 2 scenes later this is going to happen. And like
Yeah.
for some reason, a lot of people, and I've done this, where like you feel like you can't progress to the scene that you know how to write yet for some reason. You're like it's against the rules somehow. Where you've got to like fill it in, and you got to do it in order. But like
sometimes writing that scene that you're more comfortable writing informs what needs to come before.
Yeah,
So you
exactly,
go, oh right, what I need
yeah.
is this and this and this. I don't need a long scene just to get there. I just need this to get us to this section. And sometimes it's just one scene or two scenes. And so that's why it's sort of worth going. And it's okay for it to suck too. Like, you know, you get that first draft, like the draft that only you look at and then hit yourself in the face and go, I'm the worst. Why did I try? Why do I even try? Like, that's the, like, I think I got this from Sid Field. That's your words on paper draft. So you basically just say that's the one. You've got to the end. It's done. You got to show it to someone. Oh well, let me just go through it one more time.
Yeah.
and then you get it into somewhat readable shape for close friends.
Yeah, it's when you tell people you've written it, and then they go, "Can I read it?" And you're like, "Well, give me a week." Give me some time a second.
Then that's first draft, and that only goes to special people who you trust to show your stuff to, who will possibly come back and say, oh, I thought this was going to happen. And you're like, oh, that's actually a pretty good idea. And you can start sort of like playing with the shape of things or expectations a little bit more and iron out those themes. And but then when you've got to send it to actors who you're hoping will say yes, then that's a different thing as well. So it's so I kind of find those process. I mean, one thing I've learned is that my crews don't read anything, so it's fine. I don't need to impress them. They don't read it anyway. Script supervisor does. The DP always pretends, and but I think that's standard for most films. Maybe not. Who knows? Maybe it's just my guys.
Maybe, I don't know. What?
I'm only joking. I'm sure they do read them.
In terms of science fiction, the sci-fi genre, what kind of sci-fi do you tend to gravitate towards when you're thinking of like a science fiction project? Do you tend to sort of gravitate towards like harder sci-fi or like sci-fi horror kind of thing? Like what's the thing that you like enjoy writing when it comes to science fiction?
I don't think I have a real interesting answer here, because I kind of love the full spectrum. So I hang on to those early influences like Star Trek, Star Wars, and Aliens. I remember I really remember an English teacher back in school lending me a copy of 2001 and saying, "Oh, you're not going to like this. It's not one for you. It's not the stuff you seem to like." And I returned it the next day, and she went, "See, I thought you wouldn't like it." I was like, "Oh, not at all. I loved it. I watched it last night, and I watched it again before giving it back. I just didn't want to have it for too long, so you'll lend me more." And I started giving her my theory about it all being sort of like a progression of humanity, and that Hal was like a life that was made without procreation, and in that sense we'd evolved to become gods of sorts, but kind of baby gods. That's why he was a little baby at the end, and monoliths were these huge signifiers for progression in humanity, and the one near Jupiter was signifying that. And I think for a while she might have thought that I was, he's all right, before I just descended into being an irritating teenage student again. But there's more abstract sci-fi as well, Tarkovsky and stuff like that. But I think my heart's definitely. I think I love audiences and audience responses, and so when I make films, I kind of love only for the first one or two screenings. After that, it just becomes like kind of terrifying. I like watching to see if all the responses to each moment of try to design into a movie plays as intended. So I do sort of lean towards I think more the sort of like more of the Star Trek, Star Wars sort of stuff, and it's just always been a thing that I've grown up with. And I think when it comes to writing sci-fi, Dune Drifter was the first that I've written, I think. And I think if I'd written anything bigger that would get so far beyond my reach in terms of getting the film made, I think I'd get a little bit down about it. And I've had two sci-fi ideas I've been cooking away in my brain for about a decade now, but aside from one which I developed slightly with E4 way back, and even then it was only in treatment form, I haven't really written any of them, because I think it would kill me to write something and get really excited about it and then I don't get to make it. So I think we're waiting to get to that stage before I'll write it.
Well, that's why I got into writing novels, because I get that feeling where I come up with an idea, and because oftentimes my ideas are kind of massive, which relates to a question later on, but I often find that if you write something that you're like, this is really good, and you're really excited to kind of get it out there and tell the story, but like you don't have the means to do it. I mean, the first, my first book, Paragon, is like it's a massive thing. Like, it's a huge story. It's like really, really epic. And if you make that as a movie, it would cost like $100 million blockbuster kind of thing. It would demand that kind of thing. So I'm like, well, as much as I would love to make this movie, if it's ever going to happen, it's not going to happen anytime soon. It's like no one's going to kind of dump that much money at me, as a first time sort of, director or pitcher kind of thing. So I was like, but I really want to tell this story. So I decided to, write it as a book instead. So I'm like, well, at least the story's out there. So it's like,
that's amazing.
So it's like, if the movie never gets made, I'm like, well, I told the story in some form, which I think is a good thing to kind of think about it like that.
Yeah, I think that's excellent, because I mean, I don't think I'm much of a writer. I think what I find the difference between writing a screenplay and like a novel is that in film, no one chooses to read, like in the industry, no one wants to read a script. They have to. The actors have to read it to get familiar with it. The financiers have to read it to decide whether they want to pay for it, and the producers have to read it. So I always try to write something in a, come on, let's go, let's keep up. We're gonna move on to the next bit. And so it's always constantly trying to keep it moving and keeping it as clear as possible, so that the geography of everything we're trying to explain is clear and has enough of the emotional weight just for you to keep you turning those pages. And because that's it's sort of a different challenge. Whereas with a novel, I think everyone sort of chooses to read those, and it becomes like a joyous experience. And although I enjoy reading scripts, I've definitely been sent enough to go, oh no, I have to read this now. and I think that's just what the sort of the film industry can be like sometimes, sadly. And I think being aware of it and working that into the writing, which I think is like a Shane Black thing. I think he'd do that. He wrote in a style that he's like, look, the execs reading these have to read 5 a day. So, or the assistants for the execs have to read 5 a day. I just want one that will stand out. So this is how I do it. So he's got drawings in some of his as well, and illustrations, and so yes, I think for me, I don't know of another way to be able to sort of tell my stories. So I'm not saying I'm a good filmmaker at all, but that's the medium that I feel comfortable trying to sort of tell stories in the way that I can look at them and go, okay, that's what I wanted to achieve there.
The thing I find with like screenplays and stuff, because the difference is with like prose and screenplay writing is, with prose, of course, you have so much room to be so expressive and like spend paragraphs describing things and talk about the internal monologues of certain characters and things like that. Whereas in screenplays, it's sort of like, the rule I was told at college at least was like, only write what the audience is going to see. You can't write about what a character is feeling. You can only write about what the actor might be doing. And thinking about it that way. But I find that a way that you can kind of translate some expression to the stage directions or the dialogue and things is through the formatting. And because a lot of screenplay kind of writing courses and things will tell you that the screenplay writing format is very strict and set in stone. And it's like, you have to type it this way, otherwise it's like totally unprofessional. And while that's true with some parts, with like scene headers and where your dialogue is being placed on the page and everything like that, when it comes to stage directions, it's kind of like, I find that, you actually have loads of room to play in there. And I know that Russell T Davies, for example, who is the showrunner of Doctor Who for a few years, writes every action scene with dashes instead of full stops, where he starts a sentence with a dash and says like, this person runs, dash, this thing happens, dash, that happens. And it just like communicates a kind of energy that's happening in the scene, which, just writing it with normal sentences and normal full stops wouldn't necessarily do. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing to do with screenplays, is kind of find the areas where you can be more expressive with it. When you're like writing, science, this is something particular to science fiction or fantasy or genre fiction, but do you find it like easy or hard when it comes to like inventing like technologies or inventing aliens or worlds or anything like that? Is that something which is like quite difficult, or do you like really enjoy that or like want to get stuck into it kind of thing?
The difficulty is you can just pull any random stuff and say, here's a sci-fi syringe and it brings this person to life and they're fine and no problem anymore. I think the trickier part is trying to establish rules so that the audience will accept, okay, this isn't a problem being solved by pushing a button, a bit of tech can solve this. So I think so, but then sometimes you need that tech to get you out of a hole. So you've got to be careful not to have any inconsistency. So that's where I find is the difficulty, is making sure you've got the balance and that you're not having a character behave stupidly, because you don't want, unless it's intentional, because you want the audience to really be on their side. So in the case of just in terms of perspectives, this isn't technology, it's more perspective. The scene where she's hiding behind the rock and we know the bad guy's coming towards her, but then we leave her and follow the bad guy as he's searching the rock to try and find her, and then she shows up, at another point. Like that was designed not to shift perspective onto the bad guy, but it was for the audience to sort of suddenly go, where is she? Is she okay? Is she going to be okay? So it sort of it makes us more concerned for her, hopefully. And then when she shows up and she's one step ahead of the audience, she's got a solution to the problem, and she shoots him. That's when we should go, oh, we like her even more now because we were worried about her, but she's also smarter than we are, and just little things like that, and then you break all that apart and have things go wrong for her. That's the fun of that stuff. Yeah. But with Dune Drifter and technologies, I found that I tended to lean on the stuff that I'd seen in other sci-fi, and sort of found ways to incorporate that. So I think Duncan Jones did the same thing for Moon. With the limited lifespan of clones reminded me of Blade Runner. The aesthetic felt like Alien with the sort of Ron Cobb miniature look and Michael Cima production design. So I did some research into what could develop into sort of faster than light travel, and I quite liked the idea of vacuum light speed, which meant less resistance and so on, but mainly because it abbreviated, it's similar to FTL drives from Battlestar Galactica, and I quite like, get the VL drive going. So the impact and style of the blasters was modeled after the 2009 Star Trek, so I loved how they worked, and the design of the spaceships, particularly the bad guys, takes all its inspiration from Roger Coleman Kit Bash models, and this was less deliberate, but the direct rifle in Dune Drifter is sort of a modified version of the pulse rifle from Aliens. We had another one designed and it did not work, and I was like, I can't use this. So we said, what can we get? And then someone sent us his sort of pulse rifle. I went, shit, okay, we'll have to go for that. But even for something like the hard light holographic rifle aft, I borrowed that from the Legion episode of Red Dwarf, because the planned effect for the tent did not work, and I was like, shit, we got to come up with something else, because I borrowed that from Moontrap, which I fucking love Moontrap. So we tried doing that. We had all these balloons that we shot in reverse cinematography, and I just went, none of this works. I said, okay, we'll figure it out later, and so we managed to get some of the shots that worked, and then I said, oh, look, it's like a holographic life raft. There we go, we'll do that. Which, I don't know. I don't really like it, but I think we get away with it. And it's an excuse to have my mate do the vocals for it. Because that's when we had to fill in a hole. And I said, right, we need to let the audience know what this is. So I got my mate Dom and Ella. He played Mr. Vup in Picard.
Oh, yeah.
He was, and so I said, oh, look, will you just record a couple of lines for me so I can explain to the audience how I'm getting out of this hole I've dug for myself? And he went, yeah, no problem. So he threw in a couple of vocals for me. So it's a hard light holographic rifle aft. Yeah. I kind of found fun though playing with the tech. I thought that was I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed, because working with an actor like Daisy Aitkins. Like, Daisy doesn't watch sci-fi. She's not like this. It's not her thing. But we really enjoyed working together. And as soon as she sat in our little Starfighter set, she was like, right, how do I fly this? And I went, well, I think I spent about 20 minutes talking through what does what. And I said, you're going to love this. And I sort of started playing the projection screen so she could see the stars going to sort of into sort of the light speed effect, and she was like, oh, this is amazing, it's like being on a ride. I kind of enjoyed those elements of the tech and sort of taking them seriously, but also that they are rooted in the familiarity with other sci-fi. We sort of leaned into the low budget Roger Corman approach. We had to adapt because we're making a sci-fi for no money essentially. So it was pretty. It was fun. It was fun.
You've cited, sort of Roger Corman in Star Trek and Star Wars so far, but do you have any kind of specific creators or writers that are that you'd say are like your big inspirations? Who are like your biggest creative inspirations when it comes to writing or creating stories and things?
I think from a film sense, it's really quite standard and basic. Like I wish I could pull a bunch of esoteric sounding directors to flex the old film knowledge muscles, but. But I try to block all my shots with a plan to edit, and I find myself playing with proximity in a way that kind of really rips off sort of Spielberg or older Robert Zemeckis, really. But the main influence I have is how I like to run a set, so that everyone feels like they're contributing and the energy's there, and because everyone working on film at some point wanted to with so much passion, and all I want to try and do is harness that, because then everyone works their best. And for that, I kind of admire Richard Donner and Jonathan Frakes.
Are there any kind of writers that you think are big inspirations for you?
I think with the scripting, I kind of, because I only tend to read the screenplays of films I like, and I'd say one that was really interesting. I read The Abyss, and I felt that script rattles along such a great pace. And as much as I love The Abyss, I don't think the film quite rattles along with the same energy as the script. I always thought that was quite interesting. So I think, yeah, James Cameron's. I quite enjoy how he writes. It's very kind of it's very frank and to the point, but it also has all the emotion that you want to sort of get from a script. Vince Gilligan's great as well. Vince Gilligan does a trick that I really love, where, on the subject of not being able to say what's going on in someone's head, he'll describe them staring at something and say, are they thinking this or are they thinking this? And it's like, oh, that's great, because that's could they be thinking this? That gives the actor something to work with. They're able to go, oh, okay.
That's quite clever. Yeah, I quite like that.
I could work on all of those. So you don't need to say, what they're thinking. You can pose the question as the audience would interpret it through their performance. And there's stuff like that I sort of grab. Vince Gilligan does another really great thing that I enjoy, where he describes something, but then but more on that later.
Yeah.
I'm like, ooh, okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
And so that's what I use a lot as well. I think that in that sense, yeah. I mean, I think when it comes to I don't tend to go to Charles Bukowski or anything to try and think about how to write a nasty character. I just sort of look at real life, and there's always room for the actors to bring stuff in.
Yeah,
really.
Exactly.
I try to keep my scripts loose. It's structurally tight, but everything else, I'm like, right, these are the restrictions we have. These are the borders. We can play within these borders and see what we can find, and that's often how I write. Really.
When it comes to writing scripts and things, are you someone who maps everything out, or do you kind of discover it? Because some people insist that before you start writing your first draft, you have to bullet point everything and you have to have a complete outline where you know every scene and things. And other people kind of do a bit more kind of freewheel it, where they kind of start writing and sort of see where they go.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing about film for me is that there's no right or wrong way to do anything. I think people find a system that works for them, and it might be unique to just them. They found something that not many people do, or they do it, as all the script writing books say, where there's a lot of planning involved. And I don't think and there's nothing wrong with any of them. But I very much, I don't plan things out too much. I know where I want to get to, but I'm very loose with it. So, because the thing is, I'll never experience the story as an audience. So I try to find the story as I write it. So for that first pass, for the words on paper draft, the bad one that you don't show anyone,
yeah.
That's the version where I'm just like, oh, let's see what happens here. And in the case of Dune Drifter, that's when the idea for some creature lurking around the tent came up. I was like, oh well, I know we'd have to shoot this a specific way, so I wrote it to be seen a specific way. And then that presents other problems, like, well, will the audience, because at the moment we're introduced to that element of the story, we've just seen, a ship crash that we know is, the bad guys. And even though that crash is really far away, I didn't want to confuse the audience. So, we shot all of this, and I was like, oh, wow, I'm going to need Phoebe to say a line. So she says there's some sort of animal out there. And that, helps, hopefully,
differentiate that it's not the alien.
Yeah, exactly. It just draws a line, and then I guess for the first draft, I was saying earlier, so I iron it all out, and second pass, I get it ready for people to read, and then I sort of tweak it for the actors. The Dune Drifter and Night Shooters scripts were written very quickly, because for Night Shooters, I wanted to do what I did for Magpie and sort of improvise the story. We know, again, I have very strict structures, so I know what happens. But in terms of dialogue, I'm like, hey, let's workshop this and see what we get to. But we were talking to one financier, and he went, absolutely not, write a script. So I hammered a script out. He didn't end up financing it in the end anyway, but I went, oh, look, we got a script now. So Michelle was able to sort of expand her options. That's what we got to finance from someone else for Night Shooters. But I also change things when we shoot, and more so when editing, and even more so when sound and score sort of comes into it. So the whole process sort of feels all-encompassing, but it's never rigid. It's always trying to embrace what people can bring to it, because in a messed up way, it's like I've seen the movie I want to make in my head, and I'm going to look for a better one as we're making it, and see what we can do there. And that sort of works for me. It's the sort of approach that allows me in a place like Iceland to go, right, we have to do it this way now because weather won't allow us, or the location isn't as shootable as we were expecting. So it's I like to discover it. That works nicely for me, but that's just my preferred choice. I don't think there's any. I don't like it when people say, no, you have to do it this way, because that's the way that works for them.
Yeah, there seems to be a kind of, I feel like the conventional wisdom with a lot of kind of screenplay writing courses and the way kind of screenplay writing is taught is quite rigid, and sort of like you have to have 3 acts, and this has to happen at the end of the act 1, and this has to happen in act 2, and there's even, I'm forgetting the name of the book. I'll put an image of it in the video, but there's a book on Hollywood screenwriting where it literally tells you what every single page in the screenplay should be. Where like this has to happen on page 20, and this has to happen on page 36 and stuff like that. And I feel like that is because it's sort of like, if you're someone who isn't suited to kind of strict, rigid, planning before you write, you can feel like you're sort of not doing it correctly if you're not sort of hitting these beats and things like that. It's like there's good guidelines, and there's conventional wisdom for a reason, but at the same time it's kind of loose in a way, and there's room to play and experiment, because I remember there's always exceptions to every rule. With there's famous movies like, if you ever listen to the audio commentaries on the recent Mission Impossible films, like Mission Impossible 5 and 6, they're really, really good, because like Christopher McQuarrie, who was almost involved in the Star Trek thing, by the way, but him and Tom Cruise have talked about how they improvise a lot of like the plotting of their films. And there's a bit in Mission Impossible 5 where it's like near the end, Rogue Nation it is, and Alec Baldwin's character is like sitting in this oversight committee hearing room, and he was telling him on set, like, just your character is just sitting here and taking a moment to think about everything that's happened. And then Alec Baldwin was like, but what has happened? And Christopher McQuarrie was like, I don't know yet. but we'll make it up, we'll write it, And there's lots of little bits like that where they're kind of like finding it in things, and sometimes I feel like a rigid structure and kind of trying to hit deliberate plot beats can sometimes be, hamper you in a funny way, where if you're kind of finding it, then it allows you to kind of improvise properly and build off a scene. Where it's like, my character's at this destination now, well, that means this has to happen here. Or it's like, it turns out this character's the bad guy, that means this has to happen. Whereas if you're kind of setting a rigid structure of like, I have to hit these plot beats, then sometimes you can kind of miss opportunities, or sometimes you can kind of, it feels like you're pulling the characters along the story rather than the story being propelled by the characters. In a funny
it feels
way.
like all of that stuff is there for, this is what you need to do if you want to pitch to a Hollywood studio kind of school of tutoring. And it's like, I think James Gunn tweeted something recently and said, was it at least last year, and said, yeah, I used to read all those books, but I honestly don't do anything that's in them.
Yeah.
I'm a writer who's established, what it is that I need to achieve with my stories, and I know what I like and how I go about them, so I don't really follow the rules of any of these books. And we had a thing on Night Shooters where someone said, this thing doesn't happen here until minute 15. We need it to happen at minute 12. I went, the reason it doesn't happen at minute 12 is because the film opens with a 3-minute action sequence. I said, so you can cut that out, and you can have whatever you want at minute 12. And they said, yeah, okay then. And I went, okay, check the contract. I have final sign off on the film, so I won't be doing that. That was the last conversation I had with them about it. But it was really in my head, like, oh, guys, watch the film for what we've made. Like, because like this is all establishing characters who you need to care about as the rest of the story goes on. If we don't do this, if we don't establish, it seems frivolous, like it's not important. But that's because I'm hopefully disguising all the stuff you should be paying attention to in dialogue and character establishing. And like I think I might have with Dune Drifter, I think the trouble with that was that we had the release guaranteed, so I didn't have to follow any rules in terms of structuring. So I thought, okay, well I'll front load it with character development, but it's mainly story and world building. And also, there's a technical thing where when you squish everyone's head into a helmet and all you see is their face, your ability to recognize who's who is really, really tricky. So I needed time for the audience to understand the sort of cinematic language we were trying to use, so that so certain characters are only framed a certain way. So one pilot has a specific angle that relates to her. Another pilot has an angle that relates to him. Their gunner has gunners are always facing the other direction. And we always had the action moving left to right, because we had to establish like who these people were, so that when it got to the action sequences, when we cut quickly, the audience is already sort of familiar in their heads with who everyone is. And so that was all important to me. And so we're world building, we're establishing who's who, all seemingly through mundane conversation. And the danger with that is that if like the distributors have tried to make out that the film is something to do with Dune and you're ripping people off, that's going to fuck off a lot of people before they get to the fun stuff. Yeah. So so that can be a problem. Yeah, but
like, so what noble house are these people borrow?
Yeah, but it's a weird one, but that's one of the things I looked at. And of course the credits in Dune Drifter as well, like the reason they're there is to establish a tone, not so much to say who's in it, because nobody knows no one knows any of us, so it's just to establish a tone really. And so the credits aren't really credits as much as they're just
the way in.
Before we go into a pretty wormhole, it's trying to sort of set up something a little bit grim before we go to the nice stuff, before we go to more grim stuff, and so it's you look at those things and go, shit, if I have credits, I need to make sure the names in them are people like Michael Fassbender or something.
Yeah.
Then people will keep watching until he shows up.
Yeah, actually, that's a perfect kind of segue to the next question, which is like, this is a vague question, but what's your approach to creating characters? Because personally, I found that crafting great characters is kind of like the last thing that comes together in my kind of writing. That I find like creating like who are these people is quite a difficult task.
For me, the key is making sure that the best character is facing the most interesting obstacle to develop the story. And I got to do a lot of that with Night Shooters, but not so much in Dune Drifter, because I managed to flirt with it a bit during the opening section, where you establish which pilots think they're gung ho and they can kick ass, and which ones are actually in a command position but also kind of friendly. It was fun saying, oh, this character is more like this, and then you assign them the particular role in the battle that I found the most interesting. But in Night Shooters, it was one where I really was like, okay, it would make sense that Rosie Holt's character would do this, and it would make sense that Adam McNabb's character would start off as this asshole, but then sort of feel more and more responsible for everything that happens as time goes on.
I find an interesting way in creating characters is a really weird one, where you start with complete archetypes, just totally stock characters, and then just think, how can I make this interesting? How can I kind of subvert this and kind of make it new? Where like, because in Paragon, for example, in my book, there's a lot of those characters are very stereotypical on the face of it. Where you have like kind of, I've got this one character called Shepard, and I wrote him to be this very kind of boisterous, gung-ho kind of soldier type, who's very kind of loud and very kind of witty, and sort of like the big lad of the kind of the characters and things like that. And a lot of people, would compare this kind of like swaggering, charming guy to kind of like, the Han Solo type is, a shorthand way of stating it. And I thought, well, what's an interesting way to kind of subvert this type of person? And I thought, well, why not make him a family man? Because the Han Solo type is always a solo person, is always a kind of, I'm too good for it, and they're always like, sleeping about with, countless women and all that kind of stuff. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you had a character who had this personality, but they were actually really dedicated and were already settled down and had, a loved one and everything like that. And there was also like the protagonist as well in the story was, I thought, how do I make this person interesting? Because it's the classic, hero's journey of like ordinary person discovers they're extraordinary and gets superpowers and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, well, how do you make this person interesting? And I thought, well, rather than kind of, a typical, kind of chiseled-jawed, I'm the hero type guy, I thought, well, what if we do the exact opposite and make this person a really, really nerdy bookworm that's very introverted and keeps themselves to themselves and things, and how do you go from there? And it's sort of like, I find that when you start exploring archetypes that way, where we say, let's keep the personality, but let's take the motivation and go exactly the opposite direction, you can come up with some really interesting stuff. Or if you do the opposite, where you're like, here's a classic archetype, but they have a completely different personality. And I feel like that's where you end up with, like in Pirates of the Caribbean, that's how they ended up with Jack Sparrow. Because like that character's a very classic kind of, foil and kind of the unpredictable supporting character, but he has this completely weird personality, that Johnny Depp did with his whole like kind of Keith Richards impression and things, and it's like a really memorable character because of that, where it completely mismatches their personality with their actions in a funny way.
It's like that great moment in the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie when the Green Goblin grabs J. Jonah Jameson and is like, who took the Spider-Man pictures? And everything established is like he's going to rat Peter Parker out. He doesn't do it. And he doesn't do it.
He says, I don't know who he is.
Hint.
Stuff comes in the mail.
No, and he's literally in the next room. You can say he did it. Like, but he doesn't. And everyone's like, ooh, hello. It's just a little layer that lets you know there's more to this person than, and it's only hinted at, and he doesn't, and he goes right back to being a dick straight away. And gets that funny guy, he gets like globbed on his mouth, so he can't yell anymore. But it's a really great moment. And I think those are the things it's almost like it's just, if you can find a way to add layers to those characters, I think that's what it is. That's the ticket.
I think it's also important when crafting characters, to at least imagine as a writer, because it depends on the actor if they appreciate this stuff, but like kind of imagine what the character was doing outside of the story you're telling, about their kind of their life before these events and what may happen to them afterwards and things. And I always feel like this is something I do, and it's totally random and it barely comes up in anything I've written, but always give the character like a hobby, like a thing that they like to do, and it's like totally random, but it's just one of those things which kind of tells you something about them. And I appreciate that in the previous one of these that I did with Space Dock, a character he wrote in The Sojourn, in her spare time plays the cello, and I was like, that's a nice little little kind of motif in a way, because there's it's a captain of a spaceship and is this commanding figure and a very kind of you think of like the captain of a starship as kind of this very heroic kind of running all over the place and getting into gunfights and fighting aliens and all that kind of stuff, but then like giving them a cello that they play in their spare time kind of shifts your perspective a little bit and kind of gives them a slightly different headspace that they're getting into. And so I find that that's kind of a little thing that is worth doing, to try and think, what does this character do in their spare time when they're not doing what we're seeing on screen? Do they like video games? Do they like this? Do they do that? And it's an interesting way in that when you can think of that kind of stuff, then it kind of informs how they speak as well. And that's kind of because that's kind of a segue into writing about dialogue as well. Is that I find dialogue is quite a difficult thing to write, and it's like bad dialogue is very, very obvious, and good dialogue is quite rare and quite difficult to really nail. And I feel like it's something I've always struggled with.
I think with the character thing, I mean, one of the things I said to Phoebe and Daisy was that I said it's all about the dynamic of the Doom Squadron, like what are they like when they're at home. And I sort of said that like Adler doesn't get invited to things, not because no one likes her, but because she's quiet and no one takes that initiative. They're not bad people. It's just that, she said no enough times that they've stopped bothering with her, and they stopped putting her in the uncomfortable position of having to do that. But Daisy's character Yaren is the one that says, no, you're going to come out, come on, it's going to be fine. And every time she goes out, she has a good time. Like, in my head, I'm like, this is their relationship, is that Yaren is the friend that she needs to make sure that she doesn't stay at home sad about whatever's going on in her world. And I said, look, so the idea is, her arc is that she's essentially a character with no agency. She is a passenger in the backseat of a starfighter, traveling further away from a home that she's facing as she leaves. And then at the end of the film, her goal is to be in the front seat flying back home. Like, so her arc is finding agency, making decisions, doing things instead of waiting to be rescued. And like, that was, a lot of that came from randomly. I go through like mini obsessions with the plane crash in the Andes, the rugby team. Because the stories are fascinating, and there's like so many biogs that each of the people involved have written, and all of their perspectives are so unified, but also different. And I'm just like, wow, this is incredible. This is like one guy was on that plane just for a cheap flight to go meet a girl he loved, who in the time it took them to go home, she thought he was dead and had moved on, and he was like, oh. And that was it. That was his whole. I was like, Jesus Christ, he didn't even know any of them, and his stress the entire time was, I can't be the bottom of the food chain of popularity, because if I'm at the food, that was a terrible choice of words, food chain, but because they ended up eating each other, right? Eating the dead, sorry. But yeah, they was so you didn't want to be so far down on the social ladder, because he thought, right, I'm fucked if that happens to me, because no one here knows me. I'm of no value. I'll fucking die. So he was doing everything he could just to stay ahead of one guy who, back in the normal world, was socially amazing. He made everyone laugh. No place for him here. so he was the bottom, and he caught all the shit, and this guy managed to just eke ahead of him. But of course, when they came back, this guy was the one they chose to do all the press conferences because he was so articulate. So like, he found his place, but not on the mountains. So, but yes, that sort of process of because I think the main guy who was the driving force behind walking out, like Fernando Parrado, he was like, nope, I'm he was the quiet one. Like, his buddy died in the crash, so he was the quiet sort of friend of his, and he was like, I'm not dying here. And every step he took to go back, he didn't think he'd make it, but he knew that when they found the bodies, they'd see that he'd tried to walk further away from where they were, and every step was a message to his dad saying, I tried to come home. And I thought, okay, if we look at like Adler's like survival instinct through that lens, obviously we're having more fun with ours because it's sort of like a fun low budget sci-fi, but if we could sort of root it in that like genuine real life experience and try and find something in that to help inform those character choices, it seemed to work. And I think that's where the log came from, where she said she does a little personal log at one point, and again, it was emotionally weighted, but it was also a story point, because we don't know what she's going to collect. We don't know what she's looking for, because there's no one to talk to. So she does a log in case her body's found, and she makes a reference to her mum, and so I showed it to Michelle. I said, which one do you think we should do? And she said, oh god, definitely the one with the vocal, with the log. And I said, oh, why do you think that? And I thought she was going to say, so it's clear for the audience. And she just went, that thing about her mum, that really got to me. And I went, oh, okay, excellent. There we go. So the story plot is now disguised in a line of dialogue that feels like it's more emotionally weighted, but it's really there for literal plot. Otherwise, the audience doesn't know what she's doing for the last act of the film. So I think so. With dialogue, I tried to keep it natural, but and I never want lines that are like outright stating what's happening, because that's the trick. And I also encourage the cast to make the words their own, because I'm not precious about dialogue in a lot of cases. Sometimes I am, with the odd one here and there, but I also enjoy improvising. And because I edit, it's a nice way to let people try a few things, and I'll have a plan of where I can take things back later on, or if I want to build on something that's improvised, I'll say, oh, like, can you say this in this take? And so I think I just try to keep it natural. I don't try to be sort of a smart ass with my dialogue.
I think some general advice which I've heard, which I think works really well in terms of like approaching dialogue, is like Russell T Davies said that people in general don't listen to each other very well. And he says that most of the time you don't write dialogue, you write two monologues which just happen to intersect at various points. Where like a lot of people aren't really listening to what a person is saying, they're just waiting for their turn to talk again. And it's a really interesting perspective. Yeah, exactly, yeah. It's a really interesting perspective. I think it absolutely holds a lot of truth to it. But another thing that I've always thought of is that people don't like talking about like negative emotions or like heavy topics. And if you're writing a story where someone's feeling, guilty or angry or betrayed or something like that, they don't like to say it. I think you're in trouble if you're writing a character where they go, I am angry, or like, I am this, like people don't say that. And I feel like if you just kind of have that emotion power a character's dialogue, you can make it a lot more interesting and sort of add in like passive aggressiveness or add in kind of double entendres and things and sort of veiled threats and stuff. And you can sort of provide the audience with some subtext that makes the dialogue, even if it sounds dull on the surface, it makes the conversation a lot more interesting because kind of, it's like that Hitchcockian tension thing about the bomb being under the table. It's sort of like, one character's wanting to blow up at another person maybe, or confess that they love them or something like that, but the other character's oblivious of it. And there's that kind of, tension that you can play with and sort of, make the audience angry or cry or something like that. And I feel like that's a kind of fun
dramatic
thing.
irony when you're giving the audience something that they know but don't know how it relates to the characters. You can build tension off that and character off that, and and then you can reveal how much they did know. And there's so much stuff you can do with all that. I think, but for me with dialogue, I try to keep it as brief as possible. Just because it feels right that way, and especially that when it comes to a character dealing with pain, it's all about what they're not saying. It's that sort of tip of the iceberg approach to storytelling, where this is what you see, but you feel everything else.
Do you find it easier to write kind of smaller, contained stories with like less characters, or like big, epic kind of stories?
I've not had much opportunity to write anything too big, but if I did, I think the key to that is always the smaller personal perspective. Like that's what Spielberg does. It's like Saving Private Ryan, is Jeremy Davis's character. A lot of it is seen through his perspective, not just because he's the least familiar character with going on a mission, but like we're the camera's always at the eye level of the Soliers. It's always. That's what he's always trying to keep. He's always trying to sort of remind us that we're seeing things from certain perspectives. And,
yeah, he's great. But I do agree in that. Like, an epic story should always have a kind of subjective, intimate viewpoint. And I feel like Lord of the Rings movies do that really well. The Hobbit movies don't do it as well. But I would also say like someone who's really good at that is James Cameron. Like the final battle in Avatar, I think is like one of the best battle sequences ever made. Like honestly, I think it's brilliant.
Mate, you're the guy. I was wondering who else liked Avatar as much as me. I knew there was someone else out there. Yeah, I knew I couldn't be alone.
People make fun of that fucking movie, but like it's one of my favorites. I think it's awesome. And like that final battle sequence, it's like, whether you like those characters or not, whatever, but like respect the craft that's on screen in that final sequence. It's incredible.
I was so emotionally invested in that film. I was so emotionally invested in that final action sequence. Like, this is great. It's kind of like I'm like, now he's gonna make another like 4 or something. I'm like,
something like that.
No. I'm gonna have to have this argument with so many people about how you shouldn't have done it. Can you do me a favor and do something else?
Oh yeah, but like that's a good example as well of what like epic storytelling that I think like really really works. But like I personally I find it really easier for me anyway to write stories that are larger in scale. I actually find it quite difficult to write small scale stories, and it's kind of like a funny thing where in terms of like my filmmaking ambitions, in that I have lots of ideas that will cost like several $1 million to produce, and very few that will cost like a couple of thousand. And I'm like, I should generate more of the latter because it's more likely those are the ones that I'll like get off the ground first, as opposed to the other ones. But like, I find that when you have larger ensembles of characters and you have kind of more locations and more places you can go and like kind of more things kind of going on, then it just kind of helps my creative process in terms of establishing, okay, or in terms of like kind of deciding like, oh, this scene needs to be in, we need to see this, and this character needs to do that, and it allows me to kind of craft character arcs better, and allows me to kind of, generate a chemistry that's a bit easier. And I find it a lot easier to write big war stories and big kind of, epic sci-fi things and epic fantasy things and all that, and I find it more difficult to do something that like Dune Drifters, like someone on a planet kind of alone, trying to survive. I'd find that really quite difficult to write. Personally, I think it's interesting that.
But the thing is, though, I think you even though you say that, all of those that's just a big canvas where you're still telling these personal stories about characters interacting, and so it's in there. It's just a case of sometimes like, and maybe it's because this is a low budget filmmaking thing, but I have to work with, it's not often I have a set, it's usually a location. So I have to work with what I have, and the only way I can write that, knowing that it has the potential to work, is to say it doesn't matter what background is in front of the characters doing their thing, as long as that drama works. If we get an amazing backdrop that suits, is everything we wanted, great. But if we don't, we still have the personal drama to carry it until we can get to the next bit that comes close to what we were imagining.
If you could write for like any established IP, franchise, or property, whatever, what would you choose? Like, if you got the call saying, we like your take on this, what would you want that call to be about?
I mean, I think I'd be all right getting fired from a Star Wars movie and living off residuals if I don't shit on Disney for for a life. I think I'd be all right with that. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'd love to do like a Mandalorian episode. That would be that's about as high as I'd ever let my I mean, that's pretty high. Yeah, it's a good gig. That's not like, an episode of Red Dwarf would be fine. But I'd love that too. I don't know. I think there's a lot of franchises that I'd love to sort of play in those. If someone said, even though I've become the most hated filmmaker ever, if someone's like, "Oh, will you do Gremlins?" I'm like, "Fuck yeah, I'll do Gremlins." It's like, and I'd want to do the original Chris Columbus script as well, where Gizmo turns into a gremlin and is about Billy trying to kill his own dog, essentially, and the mum does. I'd like, no, let's do the version of Gremlins that wasn't made, so everyone can see how correct the original version is. No one's going to give me that job. They say, no, Mark, we want to make more of these. Can you not kill Gizmo at the end? So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I wrote half of a Doctor Who, but that was because a friend of mine's company was doing the visual effects for it. I sound like I'm really well connected. I'm not. My friend worked for that company, and he was high up in that company, and like he got on with the producer very well, and he tried throwing my hat in the ring to direct a couple of Sherlock episodes, and like none of this happened. Although I saw the season of Sherlock that he got me close for. And the episode that I'm pretty sure I would have got was the one that everyone hated. I'm like, so ultimately, it might not have done me any favors. No. But I definitely would have paid rent. And that's generally the goal sometimes. But I had written half a sort of a Doctor Who, and I think I mentioned this to you before, because I'm not as familiar with the series since it got sort of restarted with sort of Christopher Eccleston and stuff. I was like, I knew sort of Sylvester McCoy days was sort of when I was really into it. So I tried writing. I got about halfway through that, and I wrote this sort of idea that the TARDIS sort of like crashed on a planet, door down, and the Doctor was really injured and he couldn't help, and they couldn't get out, and I couldn't solve that problem, so I had them rescued, which is bad writing, just so I get into the next part where it was mainly assistant based, where they're on a planet that's going to be destroyed in this battle that they've sort of flown into. And so they got to get off, and then there's the assistant is like, oh no, we shouldn't we should help them. And he's like, we can't, because this planet needs to be destroyed in order for the war to go in the right direction so everything works out. And I had this whole sort of paradox thing where she helps anyway, he helps her, and he's like, yeah, we've ruined this now. And she's like, why would you do it? And she's like, I can't let you die. It was his angle. And then at the end, the good guys turn around and say, hey, do you know what the benefit would be if we turned this planet into a sun and we just all went somewhere else anyway? And the Doctor went, checks the TARDIS data files and goes, oh yeah, that's literally exactly what happened. Sorry. It says, I can't remember everything. And that was it. And I think it's the least Doctor Who thing. So even if I did finish it, I don't think anyone would have gone, oh yeah, this guy knows what he's talking about.
You'd be surprised.
What the fuck is this?
You'd be surprised.
It's like so I mean, I think the lesson learned is that I think I could probably write something for Star Trek and Star Wars, something I'm much more familiar with.
Yeah, maybe. Well, we've talked for quite some time now, so
I am so sorry.
Don't worry about it. Like we've talked for quite some time, so if you have any more parting advice before we go, like, here's the time. If you have anything final,
I'd say this is the most important thing, and I'd like. I say this in the behind the scenes for Doom Drifters, but I think it's really important. You have to make your films. It's okay that they're not good. It's fine. Like just make your thing. Write your script. Do anything you need to do, because the creator you are at the start of that process is a totally different creator by the time you get to the end of that process, and you've got to get to the end. And then when you're at the end of that process and you start the next one, it'll be the same, and you'll just build and improve and get better and better. And I think you just have to do that. And so many people think the time isn't right. The time isn't right. I shouldn't do this. The time isn't right. The time never feels right. It doesn't matter if you've got a budget there's more than you ever could have hoped for. It won't change a thing. You will never feel ready. So just do it. Just do it. It's okay to screw this up. Like, it's okay to make mistakes. It's fine. Don't mortgage a house to make your film. Like, you don't need to. Read Rebel Without a Crew, the Rodriguez book, and how he just looked at what he had available to him and used that to add production value to the story he was trying to tell, and he told his story. That's all you needed. That's all you need to do. And and don't think of the film you're making or the script you're writing as the one. It's the first one, or one of many that you're going to continue writing. Like, it doesn't. Like, I think a lot of people seem to think that, like, oh, I've got to put this, nothing can go wrong, this has to be perfect. It never is, and it's okay that it isn't. It's okay that there's room for you to grow, because this just becomes the first film you make, or the second, or the third. And Tarantino didn't just fall out of the sky. He made a feature that didn't work, and he just threw it away and started again and made Reservoir Dogs. But he had one that he really, like, it's the reels, I believe, are sitting in a drawer in his house, and he doesn't want to touch it. He's like, no, that can stay there. I might one day do it just for curiosity's sake. But he said that was his film school. He learned so much from screwing up that film that he was ready for Reservoir Dogs. So you gotta. It's like every time I'm doing a course or I'm working with young filmmakers, I always say, this is the people running the organizations hate this, because I say, this is where you screw up. This is where you make your piece of shit. This is where you learn that this is where you learn not to put up a fight for this, or to put up a fight for this, or where you should have put up a fight, or this is where you can make mistakes. And the people you meet that you get along with, then go off with those guys and make your personal film, and then fight for everything. This is where you should be safe screwing up. And I think your first film should be that. Make it on a mobile phone if you don't have a good camera. Just tell the story. Just do something. It's the only way, I think. I think there's so many people who will give you very good sounding reasons not to do something. That's why it's worth doing it.
I think, like Rodriguez said as well, he's like, everyone has 10 bad movies in them, so if you just get those out of the way first, then you just make the good stuff, which I think is a good bit of advice. But I think we'll wrap things up there. So thank you very much for
thank you for
joining
listening
me,
for so long. And if people haven't shut off by now, maybe put the end bit at the beginning, because that's probably the most important part.
This is the important bit, yeah. But thank you very much for joining us, Mark. And
thank you, man.
Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening to his waffle. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper. Thank you for watching. If you like these videos, subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay up to date on my new uploads. If you want to help the channel grow, join my patrons or my YouTube members, where you can see videos early as well as some other exclusive content. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons and members who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.